If you don't know me, I work for Colorado State University Extension out of the Adams County office, and I do horticulture. And today we're going to do it's be a very entry level discussion of how you can xeriscape or come up with a more water-wise landscape. At the end, I'll give you some ideas for plant selection, but we'll go through the various steps of xeriscape and talk about some of the challenges that sometimes pop up in landscape settings with implementing a lower water use landscape. I'll probably stop like every 10 or 15 minutes for questions. If you have them, just type them into the chat, and Cassie Cassie Anderson, who's on right now, or I will answer them every so often. So with that, I guess we'll get started. So a good kind of first question to ask is, what is xeriscape? I think people have different ideas of it in their heads when they think about it. The term was actually coined by Denver Water, and this is what a textbook definition of xeriscape is: a style of landscape design requiring little or no irrigation or other maintenance used in arid regions. And that's probably what a lot of us think. I want to add a caveat, though, that I don't think the or other maintenance thing is correct. Xeriscape may be lower maintenance. It's definitely lower irrigation, but there are still going to be maintenance tasks. So I don't want you going into it thinking that it's just going to be you do it and then you never have to do anything to it again once it's installed. So in a lot of people's heads, these sorts of landscapes are xeriscape. To me, this is just simply, the lack of a landscape. This is where they've just taken everything out and put in rock. That's not what we're going to be talking about today. You don't have to go to a talk to learn how to do that. It's fairly straightforward. I think that landscapes like this have a lot of disadvantages, unattractive, not welcoming, and also hot. Although the rock absorbs a lot of heat, which then radiates back into the landscape, later at night. So it can make spaces hot and uncomfortable as well. We're going to be talking about how to come up with something that's a little more attractive and has more plant material in it. So no, not xeriscape, at least not the way we're talking about it. Another good question is, why are we interested in this, or why should we be interested in it? I think to some extent, almost anyone who has to maintain a landscape in Colorado should be thinking about xeriscape or reducing their water use in some way, right? Water is a very limited resource in our state. This map is now a little over a month old. Along the northern Front Range, you wouldn't know it, but in other parts of the state, they're still in moderate drought. Kind of the angrier the colors are, the more red the colors are, the worse the drought is. So even this year, a lot of the state has been in drought. And if you go back in the time machine to the spring of 2018, you can see that a lot of the state was in even more extreme drought. And you go further back to 2013, the state was in a fairly prolonged drought. And you can go all the way back to 2002, which was a very major drought across the whole state. That color of red is labeled as extreme, which is somehow worse than exceptional, or somehow not as bad as exceptional, which I always find weird. But anyways, we live in a dry place, and we should be thinking about conserving water because it is a limited resource here. Xeriscape, as Denver Water rather laid it out, has 7 basic principles, and they're here, but I'm going to translate them into 7 just steps. The first step is to plan, to think through what will be where in your yard, to pick good plants, etc. We'll talk more about that here in a second. Then we're going to take care of the soil. We're going to mostly by amending it with organic matter to improve its ability to hold water and to make it a more hospitable environment for plant roots. Along with, there's some other side benefits of that too. Then we're going to make sure that we are irrigating effectively for the type of plants that we're installing. You irrigate a tree differently than you irrigate turf grass. You irrigate buffalo grass differently than you irrigate a perennial garden. So we're going to make sure we're using the correct types of sprinklers and we're using them right. And there's a lot of water to be saved just by doing that step, even if you do nothing else. We're gonna use mulches, particularly organic mulches, wood chips, straw, pine straw, things like that. We'll talk about how to do that to conserve water in a couple ways. We're going to make sure that we're grouping our plants according to their water use. This is a big thing, as well as other things like light requirements. Um, the basic idea behind that is that if you plant like a xeric shrub border, you plant a bunch of low water use shrubs to make a border, and in there you stick one hydrangea or one other higher water use plant, you oftentimes end up irrigating the whole shrub border a lot more just to meet their water requirements of that higher water use plant. So we group our plants according to their we group our plants by their water and light needs, and so we make sure to avoid stuff like that. We're going to consider alternative turfs or ground covers or other things opposed to just doing a whole yard as Kentucky bluegrass. Not that Kentucky bluegrass maybe doesn't have a place in a lot of yards, but we're going to make sure that we're not putting it in places where we're not using it or don't need it. And then after all that, we're going to make sure that we're maintaining the landscape properly, and we'll talk about that at the very end of the talk. There are challenges before we get into how we go through those 7 steps. There are challenges in a lot of in existing landscapes to going through those steps to integrating Xeriscape. This picture here is a very typical landscape in Colorado, right? Turf, maybe a foundation planting of junipers, a big shade tree, very typical. And if you're going to take this landscape and change it to be lower water use, you're going to run into a few obstacles. For example, the irrigation system is built and designed to water that turf. If you replace the turf with lower water use perennials, well, it may not be effective anymore, right? All those rotary heads or whatever's in there aren't really what's most desirable for watering a perennial garden. And the tree, there's another problem, right? That tree, most trees require some irrigation. So you need to make sure that somehow it's going to continue to get some irrigation, even in your xeriscape, if you want it to thrive, right? So that's a big challenge. Also, just the tree's root system is a challenge. A tree's root system can extend 2 to 5 times the width of a tree's canopy. So the roots from that tree are all throughout the yard, into the neighbor's yard, under the street, all over the place. So if we go tilling up the grass to get rid of it, we're going to do a lot of damage to the tree's root system. So, there's things we got to think about. Um, if we're doing a conversion and not starting with the blank slate, and I'll try to speak to those as we talk about the different steps of Xeriscape. All right, so how do we go about it? Let's get down to brass tacks. So there's our steps or our principles of Xeriscape, if you want to think of them that way. And let's go through them. So let's first talk about design, planning and design. What I've done here is a very basic bubble diagram design for a yard. So what I did is I went into Google Maps, I went to satellite view and put in an address, and then did a little screen. I captured the screen, and then I've just put these bubbles on it in Microsoft Paint, but you could do it a million different ways. So the bubbles are related to use, right? So you can see that we've got, maybe this is a family with kids. They've got a lawn and play area for kids or pets that are probably into grass. They've led that area of bluegrass to be just the area where they really need it. In the front yard, there's bluegrass there already in the picture, but maybe that's going to be low water use perennials because it's not an area that's used for play or pets. And so there's not a huge need to have a bluegrass or similar lawn there. You can also see, shrub borders, and the purpose of those, of course, is screening. They have a patio area marked here, maybe a vegetable garden, etc. So you can do this pretty simply for your own yard, just to kind of organize your thoughts and really look and see what areas you really, what you want to use areas for, and then you can later start thinking about plants for those areas. The old-fashioned way of doing this was to make a bubble diagram on paper, just get some graph paper and kind of do a sketch. You can see they have a plant area here, hardscape, a lawn over here. And so it's the same idea, right? So if you don't want to go on Google Maps or whatever, you can do it this way too. And actually, it seems like a really basic, maybe exercise. Maybe you're thinking, I don't need to do that. But when you actually lay your yard out like this and think about it, I think you'll find that actually it's pretty helpful. Start thinking about like, what is the use of that area? And then once you've determined what the use is, it's a lot easier to pick make effective plant choices. So that's kind of the basic, idea. The basis of planning is just figure out what different parts of the yards are going to be used for. We're then going to start thinking about soil amendment. If you're starting with a blank slate, if it's a new yard or a nearly empty yard, soil amendment's fairly straightforward. If you're dealing with an existing landscape, soil amendment can be a little tricky. So essentially, you want to add organic matter where you can. You might want to consider a soil test as well. You can get a lab. CSU has a lab up on campus you can send a sample to, or there are a number of private labs that you can also send a sample to see what you're working with. Our goal was to have about 5% of our soil be organic matter by volume. When I say organic matter, I'm not meaning like USDA organic or anything like that. What I'm talking about is organic in the chemical sense, i.e., containing carbon. So stuff that was alive and is now decomposing. It could be decomposing manure, so decomposing animal waste. It could also be decomposing vegetable scraps or kitchen scraps from a home compost bin, or along the Front Range. It used to be that you could buy, I haven't looked in a while, but you could buy compost made from brewer's effluent, from the spent barley from brewing, and that would be a plant-based compost you could use. So you want to be adding organic matter where you can. If it's a blank slate, you'll add it and then plant your plants. It's a little more tricky though if you have an established yard like this, right? Because we can't tear up that little bit of turf every year to put organic matter underneath it, and we don't even want to tear up the perennials here in the center because we planted them, right? So if you're dealing with an established yard that you won't be tearing out, you have to think about other management practices to add the organic matter back. Using wood chip mulch, which will, in your perennial bed, like you see here, which will decompose and over time slowly add organic matter back to the soil underneath it. For a lawn, you can leave the clippings on the lawn. They'll fall to the ground and over time add organic matter to the lawn. Lawns also just improve the organic matter content of the soil underneath them on their own. They have roots which are not super lived. Their roots live and they die, and when they die, they start breaking down and they add organic matter back to the soil. So yeah, and the blank slate set, this is another picture. It's a blank slate, right? Easy. Bought a pile of compost, just spread it out and turn it in. I think that shovel is a very small shovel for that much compost, but you can see how this is a lot easier situation, right? You do it all before you put stuff in, and then you can still do those good management practices I talked about later, but you can start out by amending when it's still a blank slate. Same thing if you tear out the current landscape, that's the time to amend when there's no plans. So this is just this is from our fact sheet on choosing soil amendments. It's the best information we have on, it's also in our garden notes. You can see down in the bottom garden notes 711. You can find that online. It's, I'm not sure it's perfect, but it's the best table we have about how to amend. So for an annual application or for a one-time application before you put in a landscape, we would be talking about these numbers up here at the top. So we would be, for a plant-based compost, the plant-based compost tend to be lower in salt. So again, this would be like a compost that is made with kitchen scraps. And mostly what I'm getting at there is it doesn't contain manure. Some local landscape supply companies might sell that sort of compost in bulk, but it's hard to find. If it's a plant-based compost, you use 2 to 3 inches of it. So you lay it spread out 2 to 3 inches deep, and then you turn it in as deeply as you can, hopefully 6 to 8 inches. If you're dealing with the manure-based compost, those are a lot higher in salts on average. So you have to use less of those, or you risk burning the roots of the plants that you put into the amended soil. So we say 1 inch, or really probably less than that, to be honest. That's why I said this is not quite a perfect table of a manure-based compost, and again, turning it in as deeply as you can. Those inches, if you are curious, translate into each inch is 3 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. So if you're using manure, you can use 3 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. If you're using plant-based compost, it's 6 to 9 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet. So if you're making annual applications, the other thing that's worth noting about organic matter, so annual applications would be like a vegetable garden or an annual flower garden, somewhere where you turn the soil every year, or you can at least turn the soil every year. In those situations, we would be adding less and less over time, right? So eventually getting down to where you're using 1 inch of plant-based compost and probably less than a half an inch of manure, because over time, organic matter is accumulating in the soil. A lot of it breaks down every year, but there's also what we call humus, which is the stable end product of decay, which is accumulating in the soil. So over time, as that increases, you need to add less fresh compost every year. Still have to add some, but add less. The other thing that I wanted to mention about composting is actually how it improves the soil. Just very briefly, this is kind of a whole talk if you really want to get technical, but compost does kind of magical things for us. One thing it does is it helps soil particles aggregate, which means it helps them stick together in a loose sort of structure where there's big pores between the aggregates, little pores within the aggregates. And so we get better water holding capacity, or the soil tends to hold more plant available water, I should say, and be better aerated. So that's one of the magical things compost does. Compost also, as it decomposes, releases nutrients, so it can help with your fertility. And the humus that eventually, the stable end product of decay, which compost kind of becomes, is also very good for your soil for a number of reasons that I'd get into in a longer talk. It holds a lot of moisture, has a high cation exchange capacity, and blah, blah, blah. So with that, I was going to check and see if there's any questions. I think there's a decent time to answer any. If there were any questions about using compost, using
Not
organic
just
matter.
yet.
Okay. Well, if you have them, feel free to type them into the chat, and we'll get to them here as we go along. So, okay. So we've talked about planning, we've talked about soil amendments. Let's talk a little bit about effective irrigation. Because this is only an hour-long talk, I've kind of like just crammed as much in here as I can. Again, effective irrigation is really a talk in of itself, right? But we'll just talk a little about it. So the most basic thing you need to be thinking about with irrigation is, are you watering, is your irrigation system appropriate for what you're growing? And is your the amount of water you're applying appropriate for what you're growing, right? And there's a lot of pieces to that, like this design of the system, et cetera. So like, for example, in this picture on the lower left, they're irrigating this little bed with pop-up sprinklers that spray in every direction. But the water pressure is so high that they're just misting, right? Those sprinklers are designed to operate a certain pressure, and oftentimes, especially in front range landscapes, our municipal water pressure is higher than what they're designed to operate at. So they make this finer mist rather than bigger droplets. And so you can see that mist blowing everywhere, right? So that's ineffective. That's wasting water, and that's easy water to kind of recoup or not be using, right? Another example, so that's a water pressure issue. Another thing that you might think about is the type of heads, right? Even if you're just growing bluegrass, odds are you can save a bunch of water just by changing how you're irrigating that bluegrass, right? You could change the head type. In this case, this is a fancy type of head that screws into a normal pop-up head. You just screw out the old pop-up head and screw in one of these. They're called MP rotators. They spray these solid streams of water, which kind of oscillate. So they have very big droplet sizes, right? So none of that blows away with the wind. They also water very slowly, which is actually a really good thing. It allows more of the water to soak into the soil and reduces the risk of runoff, right? Like water that is being applied quicker than the soil can take it. So the water ends up running off the lawn or other area you're irrigating into the sidewalk or street or something like that. So, you know, those are some very basic things. You can think about your head types. You can think about the pressure of your system. They make pressure reducers that you can just put in the sprinkler line that will take the pressure down to a more acceptable one that the sprinkler is designed to operate at. Or a lot of modern, if you have a newer system, a lot of the solenoid valves actually have pressure regulators on them these days too. So something to think about. So this would be if you're using sprinklers. But what I'd like to encourage you all to do is that if you're putting in lower water use landscapes, consider using drip irrigation in its various iterations. I'm not going to do a whole talk on how to use drip. You can check our Facebook page. Cassie did a Facebook Live on drip irrigation just on Wednesday. And I'm not sure if it's up yet, but if it's not, it'll be up soon. So she goes through all the components in that and how they go together. I'm just going to very briefly talk about, why it's a good thing here today, right? So when I was in school, drip irrigation was a new thing. It was very cutting edge technology. There was only a couple. At one time, there was only a couple of Israeli companies that had the patents to all of it, and it was mostly just high end farmers that have it. But that's all changed. It's gotten cheap. You can buy it at the big box stores. It's very available. Um, the way drip irrigation works is the water comes through these tubing. There's various sizes of tubings, etc., to emitters that drip water out very slowly and right at the soil surface. So that helps you save water for a number of reasons. One, because the water is being put out very slowly, all the water is absorbed into the soil. Um, Two, because you're only watering where these emitters are, and I hope you're putting the emitters where your plants are. You're only watering the plants that are desirable, that you are trying to grow. You're not just watering all the soil and encouraging weeds and watering plants that maybe aren't desirable. Also, because the emitters are right at the soil surface, we are not at risk of losing water to being blown away by the wind or something like that. So drip irrigation comes in a lot of types. For a xeric perennial garden, you might just think about running button emitters, like in this picture. That little emitter right here is called a button emitter. You might consider just running them to each plant that needs water. If you're trying to use drip in a vegetable garden around trees, this application of drip line with spaghetti tubing is what we call that technically, with emitters in the line might be a good idea. So everywhere along this line, at about 8-inch intervals, there's an emitter in the line and a hole coming out of the emitter that drips water. So this water is more uniformly. So it's good for vegetables. It's also good for trees, which have those big root systems, which oftentimes are not well served by the single emitter, the single little drip emitter that we place at the base of them when they're small, right? So, but these hook right into your drip system. You can see Cassie's video if you want more information about that. So I would encourage you all to think about drip irrigation. Don't be intimidated by it if you're not doing it. If you can do Legos, you can do drip. It all really just jams together. It's way more straightforward than most people imagine. So again, we're going to make sure that we're using appropriate irrigation. Probably drip is appropriate for a perennial garden. Sprinklers might be appropriate for turf, but if we're irrigating turf, we want to make sure we're using the correct sprinkler types and then we're irrigating correctly. And the other piece of that I forgot to mention, and I'll just circle back to it now, is that if you're watering turf, one great way, you should be trying to water it as deeply and as infrequently as possible, right? So that may be 2 days a week during the heat of the summer. It may be 3. But when you want to water for a long period of time to let the water soak in deeply to encourage your turf to be deeply rooted, which will make it more resilient to drought stress, make it need less water, make it better able to capture water when you apply it, and all that good stuff. Um, so just something to keep in mind. If you're on a heavy clay soil, that might mean you have to consider cycle and soak irrigation, which would mean that we run the system for a short period of time, like 10 to probably 15 minutes, depending on your system. And then we let it rest for several hours, so to speak, let the water soak in, and then we come on and then we water again to avoid, to make sure we're avoiding runoff. So I see the flashing thing that someone's typing in chat. Is there a question?
Yes. Is drip irrigation constant and could it cause root rot?
Sure. Yeah, good question. So drip irrigation should not be constant, right? Hopefully the drip irrigation is either hooked to it can be hooked up to a sprinkler, to your sprinkler system sometimes. There's just a valve that's part of your sprinkler system that'll come on and off, depending on how, what you set it for based on that timer, or it's hooked to a hose bib on the outside of your house. Again, see Cassie's video for pictures of what that looks like. So it only waters when the hose is on. So you might want to get like a digital timer or something that you put on that hose bib that you can leave the hose bib on, and the timer will control when the water is on or off. If it is constant, yeah, you could end up with root rot, right? That would be over irrigation, just like over irrigating with the sprinkler system. So, good question. I don't see any other questions here in the chat, which I was able to bring up. So we'll forge ahead. And if you have questions, just again, feel free to type them in, or afterwards we'll have some time just to kind of chat informally. So the next step is to use mulches and use them appropriately. So a mulch is just anything placed on the surface of soil. And so for Xeriscape, what we really are talking about most times is using organic mulch. So again, not USDA organic, but containing carbon, stuff that was alive. It's going to be straw, wood chips, or pine straw. If you're not familiar with pine straw, that's just kind of the pine needles that fall off the tree every year and kind of accumulate at their base. It's very popular in the South to use pine straw as mulch. Um, so 3 to 4 inches of mulch like wood chips or pine straw will be effective. Will have a lot of benefits in your garden, both for water savings and beyond. So one, I already talked about in a permanent landscape, adding wood mulch is one of the best ways to improve your soil's organic matter slowly over time as it breaks down. So that's one benefit. It also acts as a blanket on the soil. It keeps the soil temperature cooler during the day and warmer at night. So it kind of mitigates the spikes up and down in soil temperature, which is really good for plant roots. Means there tends to be a lot more plant roots under mulch. A mulch placed on the surface of the soil slows water loss from the soil surface from evaporation. So you won't just be losing water from the soil to the air at as great a rate as you would in with uncovered soil. Oh, and on top of that, you get if you put down 3 to 4 inches of a mulch, you will get really good weed control of annual weeds, some control of perennial weeds if they're not yet established. It will not control already established perennial weeds, but it'll do a good job controlling annual weeds, the type of weeds that come back from seed every year. If you don't get good weed control, it's probably because you're not putting down enough mulch. In an annual bed like the vegetable bed here, you could consider just using plain old straw. We would not want to use wood mulch in an annual bed like a vegetable garden because we don't want to turn wood mulch into the soil, as it can lead to a lot of the nitrogen in the soil being bound up in the bodies of bacteria which are decomposing it. So mulch is easy, it's important. Covering the soil is actually really good for the soil ecology as well, something that we should be doing. Okay, so the fifth step is making sure that your plants are zoned appropriately. This is kind of an extension of design. It's kind of like the next part, the next piece of design, right? You've decided what areas you're going to be used for. Now we're going to try to group plants in those areas according to their water use. So we go back to our bubble diagram, and we can see that we have the same areas. Some of them are exactly the same, like we're going to have lawn. The lawn is going to be a lawn, right? It's going to be a lawn and play area. The vegetables are going to be the vegetable area. But now we've taken the perennials to, low water use perennials, which will be grouped together. And by the door of the house, maybe we want like a little more color. So we pick some mesic perennials, or that could even be an annual flower bed, which will be a little area that's higher water, but has a little more color because that's maybe one of our objectives in this hypothetical situation. You can see the shrub borders are all going to be xeric stuff. Again, we're not going to be mixing in mesic plants in there, so more higher water use plants, keeping them all consistent, all xeric plants, so we can water them all the same low amount and be consistent there. Hopefully this makes sense to everybody. So now we're going to get into the actual plant material, like what plants do we use to fill those bubbles?
We have one more question on mulch.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
When would you pick gravel mulch instead of an organic mulch?
Oh, okay. Yeah, and I was gonna talk about that and I forgot. Thank you for asking the question. So let's just even make that a broader question. Let's talk about rock mulch, which could include larger rocks, like the size of your thumb or even your fist, or versus pea gravel or gravel mulch, which would be a lot smaller mulch, finer mulch. So rock mulch may have a place, so pea gravel mulch may have a place in extreme xeric gardens with heat-loving, drought-loving, drought-loving, but it's probably not the right word, but heat-loving, very low water use plants. I'm going to show you Mojave sage here in a second. It's a super low water use plant, loves the heat. It would love to be in a garden like that. Cacti would love being in a garden like that. And a variety of other really low water use xeric plants. So that could be a use for that peat gravel mulch, is a very xeric garden. However, rock mulch, no matter what type you're using, you have to understand when you use it, it's not going to do some of those beneficial things organic mulches do for like a normal garden are not going to be achieved by just by rock mulch. Rock mulch does not break down on any sort of time scale that's helpful to us as humans, right? So it doesn't improve the soil over time. It doesn't provide as good of weed control either, generally. Um, and also sometimes it creates weeding problems, right? Weeds come through it and are harder to pull, especially if there's landscape fabric beneath it. Rock mulch also absorbs and releases a lot of heat. So if you're not growing with if you're not growing those extremely xeric plants, rock mulch can actually harm your plants. It can lead to scorch. It can lead to desiccation, things like that. The best use of rock mulch I ever saw, I was at the Denver County Jail, where they have it between the inner jail and the outer jail in a space that's supposed to be completely barren. Generally, the larger rock mulch should just be used for non-plant spaces. Um, if you put it out there, what ends up usually happening is that, you end up having to use a herbicide or something for weed control, etc. And anyways, it makes a non-hospitable environment plant. So unless we're using peat gravel and and extremes may not is too strong a word, but a peat gravel in a true really xeric garden that has specifically filled with those heat loving, drought loving plants, I wouldn't recommend rock mulch. I don't like it personally, unless it's that situation we talked about. Hopefully that answered the question. And there was no other ones, Cassie?
Nope, that was it. She says thank you.
Cool. Great. Okay, so let's get into the plant material that we used to fill the bubbles that were in our plan that I just showed you. We're going to start with talking about some alternative turfs or other things we can use in place of turf. Bluegrass turf is what I mean. Probably the most common of these, most commonly seen, is buffalo grass. Buffalo grass is native to Colorado. It is a warm season grass, meaning it uses a different type of photosynthesis than cool season grasses like bluegrass. And the type of photosynthesis it uses is more water efficient. It does form a sod, so you can buy it as sod, although it's very expensive. You can also grow it from seed. It has lower water and nutrient requirements than Kentucky bluegrass. You do not need to mow it, although if you do mow it, it will look a little more like a lawn, a little more neat and orderly. If you don't mow it, it's going to look more like a meadow. If you water it occasionally, once a week, once every 9 days, something like that, it's going to look a lot more green, a lot more like a lawn. It will tolerate, once it's established, not being watered, period, in Colorado. But if it gets hot and dry in the middle of the summer, it may look a little browner, a little more like a dry prairie. Something to keep in mind. A couple of things to know about buffalo grass. One, it is not very tolerant of wear, so it's not great for pets or kids to play on. It'll get patchy if you do that, so it's not really for those situations. Also, and this could be a positive or a negative depending on your perspective, it greens up very late. It won't green up until sometime in May usually, which also means you don't have to irrigate it early in the season, which could be nice. And it turns brown after the first hard frost. So whenever we get a hard frost in October or whenever, buffalo grass will turn brown and be dormant for the year. So, opposed to bluegrass, which can linger green on into November and December many years.
We do have a question about overseeding a bluegrass lawn with buffalo grass seed.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is about whether or not you can, seed buffalo grass into bluegrass. I would not really recommend that. What's going to happen is that probably the bluegrass is just going to outcompete the buffalo grass seedlings, and you're going to end up with just spending money on seed that's not going to come up. If you want to transition from bluegrass to buffalo grass, you should make an effort to kill one way or another the bluegrass and then seed into a blank slate if you're going from bluegrass to buffalo grass. Just because buffalo grass seed is very expensive, I don't want you to waste money, on it. If it in a situation where it may not come up. So I'm just making sure there's nothing else that I wanted to tell you guys about buffalo grass. I have a picture of it here. This was a lawn in Westminster, and they irrigated this occasionally, they said. Um, to me, that's a fine quality for lawn. Like that's not a lawn that a neighbor or an HOA is going to get upset about. It's going to be a lot more lower water use. They were also a couple that at this point didn't have kids living with them, so there's no pets, so there's no dogs or kids out there making it look thin, creating wear and tear on it, which would make it look thin. So you can see what it looks like if you water it occasionally and mow it. This is what it'll look like. Oftentimes, you will find seed mixes out there where buffalo grass is being mixed with other grasses, particularly blue grama, because it makes the buffalo grass look a little denser. So blue grama is another native warm season grass. So here you can see a buffalo blue grama mix, right? Looks pretty dense, looks like a lawn, mowing it pretty short, but I don't think anyone would, complain about having that out in their yard. Um, Compared to the same time of year, just plain old buffalo grass, right? So you can see that the buffalo blue grama is a little denser. So you might find seed mixes out there that contain blue grama, and that's probably nothing to worry about. It's not it's pretty common practice. There are also, if you're not ready to go, full buffalo grass, there are also some varieties and hybrids of bluegrass, which are a little more drought tolerant. And I don't go through a whole litany of them. The varieties are always changing. There's always new ones. But one that I wanted to highlight is a hybrid bluegrass called Reveille. I have a tough time saying that word. Reveille bluegrass. And it's a hybrid between Kentucky bluegrass and Texas bluegrass. And it's purported to be about 30% lower water use than plain old Kentucky bluegrass. And you can see it makes a lawn which, for all intents and purposes, looks like a bluegrass lawn. You can find this by seed or sod. You just have to call some of the local sod farms, and a lot of them carry it, last time I checked. And there are other options out there as well. Other varieties of bluegrass which are more drought tolerant, that you can seek out. Dr. Koski, the specialist up on campus, I believe still maintains a list of the drought tolerant bluegrasses. I don't know how often he updates it because again, there's been a lot of new varieties in recent years. So that's maybe a in between you could think about. So are there any questions about other alternative turfs? I left this question slide in here. We're going to talk more about other plants, but is there anything else that anyone wanted to discuss? Any other types of turf that I didn't mention? Again, because this is an hour-long talk, I've kind of abbreviated it. I believe so. Does the hybrid grass seed work at 8,500 feet? So does it work at higher elevations? I believe so. I am 95% certain. Just like bluegrass, you can grow it up to a very high elevation, but before you buy it, ask the dealer. They should be able to tell you for sure, but I'm 95% sure that it would be okay at 8,500 feet. Okay, good. No one's gonna make me talk about clover lawns or anything. That's nice. Um, so, okay, so we're doing okay on time. I wanna press on and talk about some other xeric plants besides the turf alternatives. I may go through some of these kind of quickly just to make sure we have time at the end for questions and discussion if anyone wants to have any. But first, I want to give you some ideas for trees that you can use in lower water use landscapes. And some, because trees are such a long-lived element of the landscape, it's the most important element to get right. You want to plant one tree or whatever. You want to plant one or however many trees are in the yard, and then you never want to be planting trees again, right? Because you're hoping those live and grow large and all that. So some ideas for trees you could think about. The first one here is a very common tree, a very adaptable tree, bur oak. Bur oak is a very popular tree throughout the country. It's native to the eastern part of the country. Very long-lived tree. Bur oak's a tree you plant not just for yourself, but for future occupants of your house, your yard. It will live for hundreds of years and eventually get quite large. Very quickly, a little story. This picture on the left is a bur oak growing in Westminster. The It used to be 80 years ago or so. This is in the old part of Westminster. There was probably not even 80 years ago. There was an irrigation ditch running right through where this tree is, I'm told. Now it's a road, and the person who owns this house does not irrigate the lawn period. So it survived with all that water before, and now it survives without. And that's the example of what I mean when I say bur oak's adaptable. Almost any soil, any conditions, any water conditions, you can grow it. With the caveat that none of these trees are xeric until established. So you're going to have to water them for the first few years for sure. And probably again, if we go through extended dry periods. So bur oak's one you could definitely think about. My one caution is if you buy bur oak, make sure when the seedling comes from when you get your plant, the nursery, that you're planting one that does not have any of these bullet galls on it. It's a kind of a nuisance pest associated with them. These little galls, and it's totally genetically based. So if you plant one with no galls, it probably has resistance to the wasp that makes the galls, so you'll never get galls. And if you plant one that has galls, it's probably always going to happen. Some other tree ideas you might consider. English oak is another oak. This one's native to Europe, from Morocco to Scandinavia. A little more formal tree. Keeps its brown leaves on all winter oftentimes, which some people like and some people don't like. That's kind of a personal preference situation. Very nice green leaves. They turn kind of a pale yellow in the fall. A little more formal looking tree. But mostly I talk about English oak because I want to talk about some of the hybrids of English oak that are on the market now, which I think are good choices for a lot of Colorado homes and gardens. So forever we've had this upright English oak, which is just a selection that's very narrow, but it has a problem that a lot of upright plants have, excuse me, where it tends to come apart in snowstorms. Um, so I don't recommend that so much, but what has come on the market recently are these hybrid oaks where they take English oak and another oak like white oak and cross them. And they get plants that kind of have the strengths in this case of both of them. So my favorite of these is Crimson Spire Oak, which you see here in the picture. It's gonna be a narrower tree, so it's good for the smaller yards that a lot of people have these days. Maybe 15 feet across at maturity, 30 plus feet tall. So it stays dense. It doesn't tend to come apart in snowstorms as bad because it has better branching structure with smaller branches all along the stem instead of a few large branches all coming from the base. And then of course you can see the main selling feature is it has red fall color, right? When people talk to you about shade trees, that one of the things they always want is nice fall color, and Crimson Spire Oak has that in spades. So it's also fairly xeric. Maybe we would need water during extended dry periods, like if we go through a bad drought and don't have rain for 3 months in the summer. It might like a drink or two, but otherwise it should be okay. So my PowerPoint's not going forward. Sorry. So here's just another picture of a small one, and I'm just showing you practice what I preached. I planted way too many trees in the small yard we used to have in Erie when I lived there. But anyways, I have planted one, so I'm practicing what I preach. A final oak that I really think is going to be popular in the coming years is chinkapin oak. This is an oak that's native across much of the country from Texas to Canada. It's not planted a lot in other parts of the country because there are superior oaks they can grow, but in Colorado, we take what we can get. So it's an oak that grows here, pretty fast growing, and it has a nice maroon or burgundy fall color, a lot like autumn purple ash, which of course we're losing autumn purple ash due to emerald ash. So chinkapin oak is one I think it used to be really hard to find. I think it's becoming more and more common. A lot of local nurseries may carry it, and it's one that I really like. I have one currently in the front yard of the house where I live. A very common tree for xeriscape that you might think about is Kentucky coffee tree. Kentucky coffee tree is a weed tree in some parts of the country. But here in Colorado, it's just a tough tree, and we've been planting a fair amount of it. It's not weedy here. This is in the legume family, so it's in the same family as beans and peas. It gets a nice yellow fall color in the best of years. It develops this pod-like fruit, which you can see here. It's very woody, which some people don't like because it is a little messy, but I don't let that bother me too much. I just run it over with the lawnmower and move on with my life. But There is a podless variety called espresso, so someone was being very clever when they named that. So if you'd like to try this but don't want the pods, look for espresso Kentucky coffee tree. Pretty drought tolerant. Will need water during extended dry periods, but pretty drought tolerant. Um, if you're looking for a little more showy tree, one that you might think about, which is not quite as drought tolerant as some of the ones I've been discussing here, is catalpa, sometimes called northern catalpa or western catalpa. Catalpas are primarily planted for their flowers, showy flowers in June when a lot of things are done blooming. Fall color can be yellow and kind of nice as well, but that's primarily why they planted. With catalpa, you have to understand that it will tolerate drought, but it does not thrive during drought. It'll look sad and the leaves will be kind of scorched on their edges, but it will come through. So it's not like a tree that thrives in drought or is, that's really what it wants, but it will tolerate drought. And that's why I'm showing it to you here today. The fruit of catalpa is this long pod, and again, it might be a little messy. I don't worry about it too much, but that's just something that you might want to consider too before you plant one. So I think this is the last shade tree I'm going to talk about, and it's probably the one that if I had to bet, I think is going to be the most popular here in the next 10, 15 years along the Front Range. This is a selection of sugar maple. So if you're not familiar with sugar maple, it's native to the northeast part of the country. It's one of the trees that gives the beautiful fall color that in New England that people go look at. But in Colorado, it's always been kind of iffy because it doesn't like our soils and it doesn't like our hot, dry summers. However, what has shown up in the what is shown up more in the market recently are these selections of sugar maple, which are made from a naturally occurring sugar maple population in Caddo County, Oklahoma. So Oklahoma, right? Hot in the summer. They have alkaline soils like we do on the Front Range. You would think it would do better here, and in fact, it does. It's a pretty tough tree, pretty drought tolerant tree. It still gets the beautiful red fall color that sugar maples get. So I think these Caddo sugar maples are going to be very popular in the future. They're a little hard to find now. You may have to let your fingers do the walking and call a couple of nurseries to locate one. The most common of these that's out there is called John Parr. Is the John Parr sugar maple is the most common type of Caddo sugar maple sold, but one of my favorites.
Quick question about evergreens or xeric evergreen options. I don't know if
So
you're
I
getting
will
to
get to
that.
xeric evergreens
Okay.
in just a second. Yep, there are definitely xeric evergreens. In fact, on average, I'd say evergreens are a little more more likely to be xeric than deciduous trees. So we're getting there. Okay, so I don't want to run out of time, so I'm going to go through some of these smaller ones very quick. I'm really going to focus on the first one, which is, so these are trees that are more for very small yards or ornamental plantings. Think like crab apples or things like that, in that sort of niche. And the one I really want to show you, just because I don't want to run out of time, is Russian hawthorn. This is a hawthorn which has been selected from Mongolia, which, believe it or not, is one of the places on the surface of the earth that's most similar to Colorado. It's like Mongolia, climate-wise, Mongolia, South Africa, and then parts of the Middle East like Kazakhstan or parts of Afghanistan are very similar to Colorado climate-wise. And so this is a hawthorn from Mongolia, and it is, to me, just a real showstopper of a tree. You can see the bark is somewhat attractive. It is covered in these white blooms in the spring, very pollinator friendly, just buzzing with bees in the spring. The flowers become these red hawthorn fruits, which hang on the tree throughout the winter. Once they freeze, birds start eating them, and very few normally drop to the ground in most years, unless we get a real extreme wind or something. On top of all that, I don't have the best picture for it in this particular presentation, but Russian hawthorn also has a very nice yellow fall color. So pretty flowers, pretty fruit, pretty yellow fall color. And on top of all of that, this is a true xeric plant. Once it's established, it will survive on just the rainfall that we get from the sky in Colorado, right? It does not need supplemental irrigation most years. So I think it's a real winner and one that probably should be planted more. One of my personal favorites. Does it all. A couple other options, just real quick, for ornamental xeric trees you might think about, and there are more than these too. Hop tree is a native plant to the southwestern part of the state. Pretty much the reason you'd plant hop tree is the fall color. It is a spectacular golden fall color, and it's a native. That's one you might think about. Another that you might think about is Pinnacle Golden Rain Tree, which is, again, a smaller ornamental tree. You can see here why it's called Pinnacle Golden Rain Tree. The fruit looks like a Chinese lantern, and it's in panicles. It's papery. It doesn't make a mess. It just falls apart. You might also plant it, though, because the flower, which is yellow, midsummer, quite showy when a lot of other things are done blooming. Again, a very xeric plant. Its main drawback is that it has a really bad branch structure. So you want to make sure if you plant one to prune it to keep the lateral branches small so they don't break in storms, which it's very prone to. And that brings us to the evergreens, which we just discussed. So I think I'm going to give you 3 evergreens, which are xeric, but there are far more than this. I'm going to give you 3 kind of true xeric
Can I
ones.
interject 2 more questions?
Sure, let's do them real quick.
Big tooth maple.
Mhm.
And with all of these, somebody wanted to know whether they are high altitude, tolerant of high altitudes.
Yeah, let's go back in the presentation just real quick so I don't forget them. So first, big tooth maple is an ornamental tree you could think about. Big tooth maple comes in a variety of forms, from a more like a large shrub to a small tree. I like big tooth maple. It could probably be included here. It's hard. It can be hard to find, except at some specialty nurseries carrying native or xeric plants. So that's another reason it just didn't make the cut for this talk. But it could definitely be in here, and I am a big fan of it. Um, and there are new selections of big tooth maple, which are coming on the market all the time. Big tooth maple, there's a big debate about it, whether it's actually a sugar maple or its own species. But generally, big tooth maple is the Western version of sugar maple. It grows in the mountains of Utah and the Intermountain West, further west from there. So, and in terms of elevation, I think Russian hawthorn you can do. I assume this is the same question about 8,500 feet. You could do Russian hawthorn. Hop tree, I do not think will do well at 8,500 feet. It's a 4 corners plant. It's a little lower elevation there. I would not try hop tree there. And Pinnacle Golden Rain Tree is zone 4. So I believe you could get away with Pinnacle. I'm a little nervous. It's really going to be borderline. Um, but maybe 8,500 feet for ornamental stuff. Honestly, some of the tough crab apples are going to be some of your best choices for ornamental plants up there. Crab apples kind of have a bad reputation, but they are very pretty and very tough plants. So I'm not sure about Pinnacle Golden Rain Tree. That's really pushing it. If it was a protected site, maybe, but I wouldn't put it in exposed at 8,500 feet up there. Crab apples and some of the cherries would be good choices for you. I'll try to remember to mention elevation with these evergreens as I go through them. It's just 3 evergreens. I'm going to start. I want to get through them. I'll stay at the end and answer any questions anyone has, but I'm going to kind of push through to the end here just to make sure anyone who has to get back to work or whatever can do it. So in terms of evergreens, the first one I'm going to show you, I know people aren't going to be happy with because the juniper is in the name, but this is our native tree form juniper, Rocky Mountain juniper. I think we have to retrain ourselves as people to not just instinctively shy away from junipers. This is as close to a native plant as you're really going to get for the Front Range in terms of trees. And there are selections of it out there. So it's truly xeric, no supplemental water once it's established. And there are now selections out there that are better colors. And sure, it comes from anywhere from an alligator green to a blue green. And people have made these superior selections now of Rocky Mountain juniper that I think are worth planting. On the left, you can see Woodward, which is a very upright one, has a very nice deep forest green color. Plant Select's now promoting that. And then on the right, you can see Moonglow, which is a blue-green leafed one that I planted at a house I used to live at. And the foliage of that is so close to some of the blue spruces that are out there that to me, it's pretty much the same. Very attractive, not that ugly juniper that you think about when you thought, think about Fitzer junipers or things like that. So I think Rocky Mountain juniper is a great plant for a screen planting or even for a showcase planting if you have one, if you're planting one of these more showy ones. And it's our native plant. We ought to own it. We ought to have some pride in it. We ought to plant it. It's really well adapted for our area. And you can grow Rocky Mountain juniper up to about 9,000 feet, I believe. The next one is not a great plant for necessarily for 8,500 square feet, and that's pinyon pine. Pinyon pine is native from Mexico up north to the furthest north end of its range is just north of Fort Collins along the Front Range. Um, but in the southern end of its range, you can see a picture of a pinyon forest in New Mexico there on the left. So that forest gets about 4 inches of rain a year. Along the Front Range, we commonly get about 12. So they will survive here with no irrigation. It's kind of a smaller evergreen. I see more damage to pinions by them being overwatered than underwatered. Just as a trivia, pinyon pine is where the poor pine nuts come from. Although you probably won't get pine nuts if you plant it in your yard because there won't be enough cross-pollination. You need a whole forest of them to actually get the pine nuts. The last evergreen I'm going to talk about, and again, there are lots of other xeric evergreens, is Cook Peak Arizona cypress. This is another plant select plant. It's a true cypress. For years, we didn't think we could grow Arizona cypress in Colorado. It wasn't cold hardy enough, and I don't think it will be cold hardy enough at 8,500 feet. But along the Front Range, we didn't think we could grow it. However, this is a selection made from the highest elevation Arizona cypress stands they could find, which were on Cook Peak in, I believe that's Arizona. So they went up to the highest part of the cypress forest and selected seeds from those trees, brought them back here, propagated them, and we came up with this cold hardy variety of Arizona cypress. Again, the foliage of Arizona cypress is a much more attractive blue-green than even some of these pictures even some of these pictures make it out to be. So I think it's a great plant. Plant Select promotes it. It's pretty easy to find at any Plant Select partner nursery. They are right now working on an upright selection of Arizona cypress, which I think may be on the market in a couple years. It'll stay a little more polite and a little narrower. Again, you can see a close up of the foliage of that one. And again, probably a true no supplemental water use plant once it's established. So those are just three quick trees, three quick evergreens you might think about. Real quick, some shrubs. And I'm out of time, so I'm going to go through these pretty quick, and I'll answer questions about them at the end. But some quick shrubs. Serviceberry is a pretty low water use shrub that I really like because it's a 3-season plant. Beautiful. It's also called Juneberry. You might know it as that. Beautiful white flowers, which become this blueberry-like fruit, which is edible. And if you eat it when it's ripe, it's pretty tasty. Birds also love it. And then they can get anywhere from an orange to a red fall color, depending on the selection and species of serviceberry that you plant. So a true 3-season plant, great plant for the Front Range, one I really love. There are some other edible things, very briefly, that you might try that are lower water use. Gooseberry is a lower water use plant, which has an edible fruit. Lower water use shrub, I should say, that's an edible fruit. Of course, you'll need a pair of welding gloves to get the fruit out of it because they're very thorny. And then another fairly attractive xeric shrub you might consider that has edible fruit are currants. We have both currants that are used for fruit production are fairly tough, and then some of our native currants like wax currant and alpine currant, which will have a pretty yellow flower, nice yellow fall color, and are very tough. A xeric plant that I actually really like, the more I see it, the more I like it, but a lot of people don't like, is Apache plume. This is a member of the rose family. It's a native shrub to the western part of the United States. Those poofs you see in the picture are actually the seeds. The flowers are small and white. You can see them here. To me, Apache plume is such a western plant. It just looks like it belongs in the West. And I think, I like that about it. We live in the West. We should have plants that are adapted and have a Western character, I feel, but that's just me. Anyways, a good plant for pollinators, attractive for a long period of time as long as the fruit hangs on the plant there with those little wisps. In the winter, it does look a little like a tumbleweed, and that kind of upsets some people, but you have to decide if you care about that or not before you plant it. Lead plant is another native shrub you might consider. It's native to the plains. Pretty pink or pretty purple flowers to draw here. It's a member of the legume family. The flowers tend to have this bright orange pollen in them, and so that the picture doesn't really do it justice. That can be very attractive as well. The note on lead plant is just like a lot of these xeric plants, if you give it too much water, it's going to get out of control. It's going to become aggressive. A lot of these xeric plants you have to treat like xeric plants or they don't behave. They'll be aggressive and they'll take over a space. A final shrub that I am pretty fond of is fern. Here is fern bush, and I put this one in just because it is semi-evergreen. So those fern-like leaves will hang on the shrub almost all winter. And if it's a warm winter, they may hang on all winter. So it has some green on it all winter and has these pretty yellow flowers. And they come on kind of middle-ish of June, and there'll be white flowers on it till a hard frost. So attractive flowers all throughout the growing season. Pollinators love them. I thought I put this picture in here because there was a pollinator on it, but I think I got the wrong picture. So it's not Where's Waldo. You won't be able to find one. So, oh, and I forgot. I guess I did have skunkbush sumac on here. Skunkbush sumac is another native plant. It's not like the sumac that suckers terribly that you think of. It can be anywhere from a 4-foot tall shrub to a ground cover, depending on the one you plant. It is truly xeric, and the main reason to plant it is the pretty fall color, right? So it doesn't need much simple irrigation, and it has a nice fall color, and that's really what I like about it. So we are out of time, so I think I will stop there and answer any questions. Any questions you guys might have. We'll go to the end here and talk about questions. So the final step we didn't get to was just maintenance. And all I really was going to talk about there was making sure you maintain your wood mulch at the correct depth, meaning you'll have to add wood mulch every year. So I was a little ambitious when we ran out of time, but let me bring up the questions and see what we got.
One that just came in, any low water nut trees?
Yeah, I don't know of any nut. First of all, there are very few like nut crop trees that you can grow in Colorado, period. Maybe some hazelnuts, but generally we don't have great luck with a lot of those trees here. Anyways, walnuts, black walnut you can grow, but because of 1,000 canker disease of walnuts, we really aren't doing that right now. In terms of low water use, things that are edible, currants, the gooseberry, as I talked about, those would probably be your best options. Service berries, low water use, I talked about that. The fruits of cactus are edible if you want to get really, really wild. They taste like melons. Pretty good, actually. And then probably the lowest water use fruit tree is going to be apples or the native plums. Yeah. Some of the cherries too, I should say, like Nanking cherry and such. Yeah. I am not a big enough expert on that, but if you just grow, Cassie might have an answer, but if you just grow like any of like the beaver tail or standard cactuses they put in gardens, I've had edible fruit off of those and they're pretty good. Keep in mind, cactuses require a very specific set of maintenance procedures that we probably don't have time to get into today, but you want to be careful. So, yeah. Let's see what else. We had a question about mulch, but it looks like it got answered already by Cassie. If there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. Feel free to email me. I owe people email from my last webinar. One more. I had a lot of questions from the last webinar, and it took me a while to get caught up with them. I have one more to answer from the pruning webinar. But if you have questions, feel free to send them to me, and I'll do my best to get back to you in a fairly timely manner. Otherwise, thanks for tuning in, everybody. We're going to be doing these things every Friday, and we'll try to put out reminders in our Facebook. There'll be different topics. We're going to get more into vegetable gardening in the coming weeks, pruning, vegetable gardening. I had a list of our talks, but vegetable gardening and much, much more. So thanks, and have a good rest of the day.
Survey. If anybody is okay with taking a poll, I just started a poll so that you can answer some questions for us. Thanks.